How did France go from the dominant monarchy of Europe to revolution, terror, empire, and eventually a modern state? Why did a kingdom that looked so powerful collapse so violently? And how did a revolution against absolute rule end up clearing the path for Napoleon? As simmering discontent in the late 1700s erupted into revolution, the French nation was hurled into bloodshed, political collapse, and a struggle over who would rule it. Yet, out of that chaos also came the enshrining of key rights and principles, many of which remain cornerstones of the nation today. This is the story of how the old order broke, how Napoleon rose from the wreckage, and how repeated upheaval remade France. At the opening of the 1700s, France was still under the reign of Sun King Louis XIV, whose 72-year rule remains one of the longest in recorded history. Despite Louis's monarchical absolutism, he had done much to usher in the modern French nation through his extensive centralization and reforms. These further limited the power of regional nobility, a process which had been underway for centuries and served to develop the state apparatus. France was the powerhouse of Europe during the period. Its cultures and traditions emulated across the continent, and French the lingua franca of the elite. Much had been achieved since the tumultuous days of the Reformation and wars of religion. However, the monarch was aging, and despite France's success, she was economically indebted and overextended. As previous centuries had shown, the program of one king was never a mark of the success of the next. Due to his reign lasting so long, he outlived his next direct heirs, so it was his grandson, Louis XV, who would inherit the crown at the age of 5. For the first decades of his rule, much of it was under custody of relatives. The young Louis was able to reap the rewards of his grandfather's productive reign. France remained at the height of its cultural power. He maintained these outward displays through patronage of the arts and an array of grand buildings, with even more constructed than under his predecessor. Internally, though, things were stagnating. He made few decisions which modernized the nation, kept the tax burden on the poor high, and undermined the standing of the monarchy through the numerous financial scandals its officials were implicated in. Ultimately, while not a disastrous king in his own right, the reportedly timid Louis equally did little to develop the nation or secure the position of the monarchy in an increasingly socially stratified France. The age of Enlightenment was now upon Europe. It built on aspects of Renaissance humanism and its emphasis on rationality, but went further. Empiricism, the primacy of science, and a new philosophical and debating tradition grew to dominate. It developed both in France's elite educational institutions and her vibrant urban coffeehouse and salon scene. Informed by expanding print networks, global trade, and scientific exchange, it marked a significant challenge to older religious and traditional explanations of politics and society. With titans of the age like Voltaire making their mark, the French monarch and state, now well-established patrons of the art, were initially supportive. However, as this flourishing movement gained momentum, they began to realize the threat it posed. Demands now included more rights for the common man and a predictable challenge to the idea of the divine right of kings. This was the ideological underpinning of the future revolution, which, though it would take decades to emerge, was now very much simmering. While colonial holdings had reached their height under his predecessor, Louis XV would oversee a drastic decline in fortunes with France's loss to Britain in the French and Indian War. This conflict theater was part of the broader 7 Years' War being fought in Europe, and in the concluding peace settlement of 1763, France was forced to surrender most of its mainland North American empire to Britain, while Louisiana west of the Mississippi went to Spain. This was a heavy blow for a kingdom already under financial strain. New France had encompassed a huge area, from access to the rich fur grounds of the Great Lakes region down to Louisiana in the south. Its loss cut off strategic territory and trade networks at a time when the nation could ill afford another blow, as well as damaging France's international prestige. This, in turn, hurt the standing of the monarchy. Louis XV would preside over further years of internal mismanagement as the nation edged ever closer to internal strife. The heavy taxation system known as the taille, which fell primarily on the peasantry, combined with a series of food shortages and the perceived excess of court, meant by the time of the monarch's death in 1774, France was essentially a tinderbox. Upon Louis XVI's coming to the throne in 1774, he was largely shackled by the disastrous economic inheritance and the wider damage left by France's imperial losses. He did, however, give support at a crucial time to the revolutionary cause in the American War of Independence, which helped turn the conflict global and edge the odds in the colonists' favor, while also deepening France's debt crisis. It is also important to note that reform was attempted. Ministers such as Turgot, Necker, and Calonne tried to restrain spending, rationalize taxation, and push some of the burden onto privileged elites. But these efforts ran into resistance from entrenched interests, the parliaments, and the assembly of notables, while the crown itself wavered. However, huge sums of money were still spent on state functions and the upkeep of lavish properties. This included the sprawling Palace of Versailles, which had become synonymous with brazen displays of wealth and excess. By the late 1780s, the deeper fiscal crisis was being driven above all by debt, war costs, and a tax system that could not effectively reach the privileged, while court spending remained politically toxic because it symbolized a monarchy detached from its subjects. For a kingdom already burdened by inequality, privilege, and a distorted tax system, this only sharpened the sense that the monarchy lived in a different world from its subjects. Along with the unjust tax system, poor harvests, and rising bread prices, these were some of the sparks that would help light the fuse on the French Revolution. Though sporadic regional riots had been occurring in the years prior as a result of citizen discontent, events would gather pace in 1789. Under pressure from the national crisis, King Louis XVI convened the Estates General for the first time since 1614 in an attempt to create a sense of inclusion and stem the crisis. However, it wasn't enough. Popular resentment was sky high, as was the appetite for change, fueled by decades of Enlightenment ideals. July 1789 saw the iconic storming of the Bastille. In the weeks that followed, and amid the great fear in the countryside, the National Assembly moved much further. On the night of the 4th of August, it struck at feudal dues and privileges, and later that month, it issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This was a key moment in the destruction of the old order and the modernizing of the nation. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted in late August 1789, was a formative document which represented the ideals of the early revolution and would go on to influence constitutional thought and democratic movements for centuries. However, chaos and rapidly changing dynamics characterized this period. Attempts were made initially at a constitutional monarchy, with King Louis still in place as more of a figurehead. These were brought to an end in 1792, though, when the king was deposed in an insurrection by revolutionary factions dissatisfied at the pace of reforms. This led to the establishment of the French First Republic, which would persist until its replacement by Napoleon's empire in 1804. As well as the bloody end of the French monarch with Louis's execution in January 1793. The replacement of a centuries-old monarchic framework with a citizen-ruled country proved a challenging process, and conflict dominated the leadership over the next years. A new governing body, the Committee of Public Safety, would oversee a year-long reign of terror in which political enemies and others were executed. Around 17,000 were officially put to death, with thousands more dying in prison or without formal trial. This eventually gave way to the more collective Directory, which persisted for another 4 years. However, racked by internal division and weakness, conditions were ultimately set for Napoleon to seize power for himself. The young commander was on the ascendancy, having distinguished himself in warfare such as the Battle of Toulon against royalists and foreign allies including Britain. He had also notably helped put down a royalist insurrection in Paris. Here, at the Place du Carrousel, he deployed cannons loaded with grape shot to wipe out the first line of charging royalists, thus ensuring victory and his increasing standing in the nation. Ever the opportunist, and seeing the nation racked by these divisions, Napoleon made his move. In the coup of November 1799, he seized power and established the consulate. This council, with Napoleon as first consul at its head, would rule France for nearly 5 years before he first made himself consul for life and then crowned himself emperor in 1804. Even in the years prior, he had been growing increasingly authoritarian, and it seemed clear many of the ideas of the revolution were being lost to this new, self-styled emperor. Arguably, the near-constant war mounted by France's neighbors against her who were hostile to the revolution and this new anti-monarchist threat had created the conditions for Napoleon. External military pressure gave rise to the need for a military strongman, which a citizen rule model in its nascency couldn't compete with. Despite the trampling of many of the revolution's ideals by Napoleon on his path to emperor, he did still carry out many reforms. These proved significant in modernizing the nation, albeit often unaligned with the intentions of the late 18th century movement, which had swept away the monarchy. Napoleon can be seen as the figure who finalized the process of the centralization of power around the ruler. This had been an ongoing struggle for French kings from the earliest times of the nation, with many regional nobles enjoying near autonomy for long periods. Now, however, as an emperor in the style of Caesar, Napoleon gathered vast power around himself at his courts in Paris. A new class of capable prefects were charged with administering France's regions. Powerful and important figures, but crucially servants of the state and not nobles of the past, presenting themselves as rulers. This served to simplify and increase the efficiency of administrative processes, also providing more uniformity across France's widely varying regions. He oversaw mass infrastructure development, centralization of education, and an emphasis on meritocracy over inherited rights of nobles. The taxation system, which had effectively collapsed through the years of the Revolution, was also rebuilt and developed into a modern and efficient example of the era. With it in place, France could plan ahead, better fund its military, and generally function as what we would recognize as a more modern nation-state. In the area of religion, the radical departure made by the early revolution was abandoned, and relations normalized with the Catholic Church through the Concordat of 1801. This helped restore working relations with the papacy, brought Catholic worship back into a recognized public framework, and reduced one major source of instability, though on terms that kept the state firmly in control of appointments and much of church life. Napoleon, ever the pragmatist, also granted tolerance to other religious denominations, making a return to the sectarian conflicts of earlier centuries less likely, even if tensions hardly vanished altogether. In many of these areas, it can be seen Napoleon was informed by Enlightenment ideals, himself also holding the sciences and arts in high regard. This is embodied in the Napoleonic Code too, which consolidated equality before the law, civil property rights, and the end of feudal privilege, while standardizing inheritance, though it also strengthened paternal authority and limited women's rights compared with the Revolution. Many of these civil principles, though not all, have remained cornerstones of the nation. However, in terms of his personal approach to rule, it was more autocratic emperor than the citizen democracy envisaged by the Enlightenment thinkers. Regardless, Napoleon ushered in an era of dominance for France, instilling a confidence which had faded through the turbulent revolutionary years. His program, though, ultimately would be defined and dominated by external threats. They helped ensure his reign was relatively short, and that chaos would once again return to French rule. From before his rise to power, rival European states had been agitating against revolutionary France. Its anti-monarchical turn was seen as a major threat, but so too was its expanding power in Italy, the Lower Countries, Switzerland, and the German lands. Napoleon concerned himself with these struggles as a young military leader, first at Toulon and then during his Italian campaign of 1796 to 1797, which cemented his reputation as a truly capable military leader. The wars of the Second Coalition then ran from 1798 to 1802, pitting France against a shifting alliance that included Britain, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, Austria, and various Italian powers. The coalition's basic aim was to roll back French gains and contain the revolutionary state before its political model and armies spread further. In 1800, Napoleon crossed the Alps, struck into northern Italy, and at Marengo, turned what had nearly been a disastrous day into a narrow victory that secured Lombardy and strengthened his political authority in Paris. For a moment, peace seemed possible. The Peace of Amiens in 1802 paused the fighting, yet neither Britain nor Napoleon trusted the settlement to last. When war resumed in 1803, the conflict entered the phase now usually called the Napoleonic Wars. The Third Coalition, formed around Britain, Russia, and Austria, later joined by Sweden, with goals that were concrete as well as ideological. To force France out of Italy and Hanover, to restore the independence of states such as Holland and Switzerland, and to curb a power that was beginning to dominate the continent. Napoleon answered with one of the most brilliant operational swings of his career. Having massed an invasion army on the Channel coast for a projected blow against Britain, he suddenly wheeled that force east, crossed the Rhine, encircled an Austrian army at Ulm, and marched on Vienna. He then lured the Allied armies into battle at Austerlitz in December 1805, where the destruction of the Austro-Russian force became the signature triumph of his rise. It broke the Third Coalition, forced Austria into the Peace of Pressburg, and confirmed that France had not merely survived the revolution, she had become the central military power of Europe. That success, however, only reshaped the map for the next round of the war. The Fourth Coalition was driven largely by Prussian alarm at Napoleon's growing influence in Germany, especially after he organized the Confederation of the Rhine under French protection and further reduced the independence of the old Holy Roman world. In 1806, the Prussian army was shattered at Jena and Auerstedt, and in 1807, the Russians too were beaten after the savage winter fighting of Eylau and the decisive battle of Friedland. The treaties of Tilsit left Napoleon at the height of his power. Prussia was humbled, French influence spread deep into Central Europe, and Napoleon could redraw frontiers, elevate client rulers, and use satellite states as buffers, allies, and recruiting grounds. Yet, the same victories created new burdens. To defeat Britain, whom he could not overcome at sea after Trafalgar, Napoleon turned to economic warfare through the continental system. A blockade meant to cripple British commerce by closing European markets to it. On paper, this was a grand strategic substitute for naval inferiority. In practice, it was difficult to enforce, damaging for many coastal economies and deeply resented by allies and subject peoples alike. Portugal's refusal to comply helped pull French forces into Iberia in 1807, while Napoleon's intervention in the Spanish Bourbon crisis in 1808 ignited the Peninsular War. French armies won the battle and occupied cities, but they could not fully pacify the countryside or stop British, Spanish, and Portuguese resistance from returning again and again. Guerrilla attacks, sieges, long supply lines, and Wellington's growing army turned the peninsula into a constant drain on men, money, and attention. Austria tried once more in the Fifth Coalition in 1809, hoping French distraction in Spain would create an opening. Though Napoleon recovered from the shock of Aspern-Essling and won the bloody Battle of Wagram, forcing Austria into the Treaty of Schönbrunn, even this victory showed a change. He was still formidable, but no longer effortlessly irresistible. Throughout, Napoleon demonstrated his great skill as a commander and statesman, securing stunning victories across fronts and terrain. He excelled at concentrating artillery and moving it quickly on the battlefield. But his real military edge was broader than that. He refined the corps system into a powerful instrument, self-contained formations with their own staffs, infantry, cavalry, and guns that could march separately, live off wider areas, and then rapidly combine for battle. This gave French operations a speed and flexibility many opponents struggled to match, especially in the great campaigns from Ulm to Friedland. Promotion by merit, mass mobilization, and the use of allied contingents also allowed France to field armies of enormous scale. At home, these military achievements were paired with enduring institutional ones. He helped stabilize state finance through the Bank of France, built a more centralized administrative machine through prefects, expanded lycée and state-directed education, and created the Legion of Honor to reward service rather than birth one. In the legal sphere, the Civil Code of 1804 systemized the law, entrenched equality of male citizens before it, secured property rights, and confirmed the destruction of feudal privilege, even as it also restored a strongly patriarchal family order and narrowed some of the gains women had seen under the Revolution. These achievements mattered because they outlasted his battlefield empire. But the empire itself increasingly depended on continued victory. The continental system antagonized both friends and subjects. British sea power blunted its effect, and Napoleon's domination of Europe forced other rulers into repeated efforts to break free. Russia in particular drifted away from his system, and in 1812 he launched an invasion that would fatally damage the whole structure. He assembled the largest army Europe had yet seen, and expected the campaign to be decided quickly. But the Russians traded space for time, withdrawing inland, scorning a decisive peace after Borodino, and abandoning Moscow rather than surrendering the war. When Napoleon retreated, starvation, cold, exhaustion, disease, and constant attacks shredded the Grande Armée. What returned west was not the instrument that had won Austerlitz. Sensing weakness at last, his enemies gathered in the Sixth Coalition. Even though Napoleon still showed flashes of brilliance in 1813 and again in the 1814 campaign in France, the decisive defeat at Leipzig destroyed what remained of French dominance in Germany and Poland, and the Allies then invaded France itself. Paris fell in 1814, Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to Elba. His return during the 100 Days briefly revived the struggle, but the Seventh Coalition mobilized immediately, and Waterloo in June 1815 became his final defeat. He abdicated again and was sent to St. Helena, where he would spend the rest of his life. Nonetheless, He had made his mark with a host of reforms and etched himself into the cultural memory of France, a symbolic ruler who had overseen a period of French dominance in Europe and stabilization following the bloody revolutionary years. As had long been the wish of France's enemies, the Bourbon royal line was restored first in 1814 and then again after the 100 Days in 1815 following Napoleon's fall. Foreign troops remained in France until indemnities were paid, while Bonapartist figures were purged from office. Though it might seem like a step back from the Revolution and Napoleonic years, the reality was more complicated. The restored monarchy didn't return to absolute rule, it had to govern constitutionally. Much of the land lost by the nobility was never restored, and many of the key civic rights established over previous decades remained firmly in place. This shows that while they were desperate to quell revolutionary threats to their near-familial rule across Europe, there was an awareness that coming down too hard could simply reignite a new revolution. This too shows the power of the French populace and the value of their hard-fought gains over the previous years. The last of the restored Bourbon monarchs, Charles X, upset this balance though. He sought to deepen compensation for landowners who'd lost out in the revolution, as well as restore a level of pomp and brazen displays of wealth to court similar to the Ancien Regime era. Consequently, in 1830, he was overthrown in the July Revolution, ushering a new shift in power dynamics. The July Revolution of 1830 was less socially broad than 1848 and was driven heavily by liberal elites, though Parisian workers were also crucial in the fighting. Many of the rapidly growing population of French merchants and new money families felt the emphasis placed by Charles X on the old noble class excluded their interest. Through the installation of another monarch, this time Louis Philippe from the Orleans family branch, they saw their interests and opportunity for further advancement better represented. In his reign as Louis Philippe I, he remembered those who had helped lift him to power, governing in large part on behalf of this growing middle class. However, he did represent key changes in certain areas and can be seen as more of a modern technocratic leader compared to earlier Bourbon monarchs. He rejected the pomp of court and surrounded himself with businessmen rather than nobles. He changed the royal title from King of France to King of the French, a subtle difference, but one which significantly recognized his legitimacy as granted by the population rather than by God. He also restores the old French tricolor, leaving the white Bourbon Restoration-era flag with all its aristocratic associations. Revolution, though, would return again in 1848. Unlike the July Revolution of 1830, this one ushered in greater change with its broader popular support and more rigorous demands. Louis Philippe was deposed, ending the July monarchy and ushering in the Second French Republic. This came amid a popular desire to return to the Enlightenment principles and civic rights of the First Republic. However, the movement was plagued by infighting and factionalism, and despite their success in ousting the king, the foundations were weak. In this climate, Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, gained election as president of the new republic, presenting himself as an anti-establishment candidate. However, due to the inherent weakness of the system, he was able to seize power in a coup in 1851, installing himself as Emperor Napoleon III. Thus began the Second French Empire, and again, a movement born in popular unrest was consolidated by an authoritarian ruler. As with his uncle, Louis Napoleon would clamp down on civic reforms and political movements while still overseeing a period of stability and growth for France economically. This included the acceleration of industrial growth, major infrastructure investment, and overseas expansion, while new banks helped finance parts of the economy. The 1850s, therefore, saw a relative boom, which helped at least placate some of the demands from his opposition. However, into the next decade, Public discontent was growing with his authoritarianism and censorship of the press. Louis relaxed some laws in response, but this only ended up fueling radicalism, especially among industrial workers. The final nail in the coffin for his reign was the rise in Prussian power, which he had failed to confront effectively. France's swift defeat in the war with Prussia in 1870 led to the collapse of his rule. Louis fled to England, and the Third French Republic was declared. This iteration would continue until invasion by German forces in World War II, making it the longest period of constant rule since before the Revolution. While internal factionalism remained between royalist sympathizers, their more radical counterparts, and everything else in between, it was nevertheless a period of more stable rule. The tax base grew. Centralization progressed, with major regional differences eroded. Industrialization advanced, and the economic middle classes grew. Externally, it was also a period of colonial expansion, not seen since before the Revolution. French presence in West Africa expanded significantly, as well as possessions in Indochina. All of this helped build national pride and unity. Though a simplification of some of France's complex internal divisions, the later part of this period, especially from between the 1890s to the outbreak of World War I, is often called the Belle Epoque, denoting the economic growth, technological advances, and general optimism of the era. However, unfortunately, brutal events of a new European war would soon shatter this spirit. The colorful period of 18th and 19th century France was packed full of significant events for the nation. From the final days of an opulent Ancien regime, through to the bloody revolution and sweeping changes it ushered in, these years tore down old structures and forced France to redefine who held power and on what basis. These would include the enshrinement in law of some key civic principles and Enlightenment ideals, as well as providing the conditions for the rise of Napoleon and decades of new European conflict. So how did France become modern? Not through one clean revolution, but through repeated cycles of revolution, terror, empire, restoration, and republic. These were centuries of great upheaval, which ultimately gave way to a truly modern France. In the next episode, we will explore how France evolved from the end of the 19th century to present day. The maps in our videos? Those are the light versions. For our shop, we take the same research and go all in. Finer line work, higher resolution, extra texture, geographic details that would get lost in a video. These are built for people who want the real thing. Something you can reference, hang up, or just own because it's the version we actually wanted to make. The kind of map you don't scroll past, you keep. Check your favorite on our website at nologia.co or by clicking the link in the description.